The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series on American history. We're getting into lesson 5. The first section is on the Gilded Age. My name is Paul. I am the teacher, social studies teacher here at Penn Foster High School. Some quick, just kind of housekeeping tips in terms of for those of you who are looking for help. As you're going through your Penn Foster studies, myself and the rest of our educational staff are certainly here to help you. So please, if you do have questions, reach out. You can do it by phone, as well as on our help and support page. You can be able to search for questions and frequently asked questions. You can also contact us through chat and by email. Again, all on that help and support page. On your program and courses page, we also have our high school webinar schedule, which includes our appointment scheduler, our live help office hours, as well as our webinar schedules for everything from social studies to English, science, math, and also our Spanish elective. So we're all available there to be able to get a little additional help as you go through your program. You can also text the word LEARN to 39033, and that'll also get to the high school department for any help that you need. So again, we are here to help you. We want to be supportive. We want to hear from you. We want to know what we can do to help you be successful in the program. So please, please, please take advantage of these resources so you can get the help that you need, and we can know exactly what it is that is causing problems and causing concerns for you guys. So that helps us as much as it helps you as well. So as I mentioned, today's webinar is going to be focusing on the Gilded Age, and we're going to be focusing on 4 core objectives. So the first one, we'll look at sort of the beginning of the Gilded Age with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. We'll look at some of the new tycoons or the new industrialists who come out of the Gilded Age, as well as how Americans begin to view wealth differently with the Gilded Age, and then the politics and how the government functioned throughout the Gilded Age as well. So those are our essential goals, our essential objectives for the day. Any questions so far? None so far. Please feel free to post those questions as we go along. I'll be more than happy to answer them. So first, let's talk about the post-Civil War economy. This is really where the Gilded Age begins, again with the end of the Civil War. That we see the northern factories that really helped churn the war effort in the North and able to eventually lead to the success of the North and the Union Army. Continue to grow and continue to produce more and more goods and services. And that really helps propel the idea of connecting the entire nation with railroad. One of the big concerns during the Civil War was the fact that our politicians began to realize what a negative it was that there was such a disconnect, such a divide between the North and the South, that no one in the North really understood the Southern agricultural economy and slavery, and no one in the South really appreciated the industrialization of the North and the economy of the North. So Northern Union politicians, starting with Abraham Lincoln, really began to believe in the expansion of railroad, and that could be the way that connects the economies of the entire nation and really able to help build the production of the United States and the industrialization of the United States. We also see the small businesses growing, which help spur new technologies. And then we see, as we'll talk about with our Gilded Age tycoons, the competition between businesses and sort of the changes that come with that. And so the captains of industries that lead to more and more wealth to the most elite of Americans, as well as beginning to see how corrupt our political system becomes through the Gilded Age and beyond, which leads to the next big era in American government, which was the Progressive era, that started off with the small towns, small cities, and that all the way led to Teddy Roosevelt becoming president and sort of the Progressive era of the national government. So we first look at the binding of our nation by rail. Again, our belief was that America not only needed to grow as a country to reach ocean to ocean, Atlantic to Pacific, this idea of manifest destiny that we talked more about in previous lessons, in which America believed, and particularly American politicians believed, that America was destined to expand its territory, not only just be a Atlantic Ocean country, but an entire nation country. So it would go across all the way to the Pacific, and eventually grow with territories and the new states of Alaska, of Hawaii, of islands in the Caribbean as well. That this idea that we were destined to own those territories, and now it becomes a destiny of connecting all those areas. It's not just a matter of owning the property, having Americans in those areas, but also having a connection between California in the West with its industries and its mining, but then connecting it to New York, connecting it to Philadelphia, connecting it to Atlanta, all these areas in the East that could also prosper from the productions that are going on in California. And the best way to do so was, and also believing in the growth of territories. That we have a lot of people in, we have a lot of land in the areas of what is now Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas. We have all this land, but very few people there. So the idea of building a railroad system that went across the United States would allow for more growth. More people would want to move to these settlements that are right off the railroad and be able to build businesses, be able to build societies, and build cities around the railroads. So two companies, when the Transcontinental Railroad is approved in the United States Congress and by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, two companies set up as the companies that would build the railroad and connect the nation. So the Union Pacific started off in Omaha, Nebraska, and traveled west. The Central Pacific Railroad started in Sacramento, California, and moved east. And each company gained a very substantial government contract with their work. So they would not only be paid per mile of rail. The Central Pacific ended up getting a little bit more money per mile of railroad because they were building their railroad through a lot of mountains, particularly the Sierra Nevada mountains were the most difficult ones. So even though they traveled shorter, even though they ended up putting fewer miles of rail than the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific was also having to go through all these mountain ranges and figure out the new technologies that were required for this massive building. They would also get 640 acres of public land per mile. So as they went along, they were able to set up basically railroad stops and say, okay, this is going to be a town. We now are able to sell plots of land to those who would like to be able to settle in these new railroad stops. So they made both the Union and Central Pacifics were able to kind of watch the dollar signs go as they were going, mile by mile, building the railroad, and able to see more money that they could then get from Americans moving westward. And also each of the territories or each of the states that the railroads were going through, they also kicked in some money per mile to both the Union and Central Pacifics. So those are the two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. If there are no questions, we will move on to the actual workers, those who were working through the conditions building the railroads. And it's really those folks that we sort of consider as the ones who would be the transient people who would want to travel, who would have no necessary connections to either the East Coast cities or the West Coast cities. starting with immigrant populations. So the new immigrants who are coming in from Ireland, Germany, other Northern European countries needed work. And so many of these younger men said, you know what, I can't get a job in New York right now. I'm living in tenement housing. I'm living in horrible conditions. I'm not finding a good job. I'm not making a lot of money. This Union Pacific, who's now going to be building a railroad, let me go work for them. We also see Chinese immigrants starting who've moved to California. Again, limited housing, limited job opportunities. So they see the Central Pacific Railroad and say, you know what, let me go work for them. Let me go be able to travel. Let me go and all my living expenses are going to be paid for by the railroad. Let me go and work for them. I don't have to worry about housing. I don't have to worry about food. All of that's taken care of by the company and the government. Let me go do that. We also see a lot of newly freed slaves. Many of them are now off the plantation. Many of them are struggling to find work, struggling to be able to afford to raise a family, be able to get educated. So many of them decide, you know what, it's worth my time, it's worth the opportunities and the danger. Let me go and work for the railroad and be able to begin to make a new life. Again, I don't have to worry about housing. I don't have to worry about food. All of these aspects are things that are going to be interested to those groups that are either newly arrived or newly free. We also see Civil War veterans. We see this with every war, it seems, that veterans come home and there aren't enough jobs to go around. That jobs that they had were being taken over by those who now have joined the workforce. So many of them are now displaced, and they see the opportunities of the railroad and say, you know what, it's worth it. Why not? Let's go try and make a new life in the West, in the Western Territories, on these railroad jobs. And we see so many new engineering marvels in construction during the railroad. Thinking back, as I mentioned, the Central Pacific going through miles and miles of mountain ranges. So we gain so much information about the uses of explosives, the uses of trestles to build up railroads across mountain ranges. We learn about the new technologies in steel to make the railroad ties. The technologies of, as I mentioned, these railroad workers needed a place to live. So both companies had to basically build a city on wheels to allow for the workers to live and work essentially on the railroads. So the engineering of those buildings on rails was another feat that had to be endured by both the Union and Central Pacific railroads. It did come to an end. They were both successful. They met in Promontory Summit, Utah, where a golden spike was was hammered in by the Central Pacific owner Leland Stanford, who would eventually become governor of the state of California. In a ceremony, they were able to put in this golden spike connecting the two railroads, thus connecting the east and the west of the United States, and immediately begin to see an easier travel between the rail systems of California and the rail systems of the eastern half of the United States. And this immediately begins to see the not only promotion of the Gilded Age of the economy with new opportunities for businesses, but new sort of population growth in the West as well. That leads me to our first poll question of the day. What was a perceived benefit of building the Transcontinental Railroad? Was it to keep our soldiers in the military? Was it for some former slaves to be able to only be able to find work in the South? Or was it the population growth and development of those Western territories? Give you guys about a minute or so to put in your responses. All right, thank you so much for your quick responses. The answer, of course, was the population growth of the development in the and development of the Western territories. Looking back at this slide, it was veterans and it was freed slaves that had a large portion of the population of the workers on the railroad. So obviously, we see already just in the workforce of the railroad the opportunity for a lot of people to be able to move out west, move into these territories, and build a life based on the stops of the railroad. Any questions as we continue on? So I do see a good question. So all the different groups that came together, you know, the Civil War veterans. I didn't say it was North or the Union or Confederates. It was both. So what kind of conflicts occurred between these different groups? Could it have been a conflict between Civil War veterans? Was it between immigrants and Native folks? There was some conflict, but we think back to why the Civil War was as bloody as it was partially because there was such a connection between the soldiers on both sides. And so when the war ended, there was a huge opportunity and a huge drive, almost to a fault. We see a drive of building a connection back between Northern and Southern soldiers and Northern and Southern society. I say to a fault because we almost immediately were told by politicians, hey, let's stop, let's forget about slavery. Let's forget about the atrocities of war, the atrocities of slavery. Let's just be a country again. And that almost kind of muted the ability of the country to have a conversation about slavery and have a conversation about the rights of African Americans in Reconstruction. And we'll kind of talk about Reconstruction in a few minutes as it connects to the Gilded Age as well. But there was sort of the conflict was really between the Native Americans, who obviously were living in these Western territories before the railroad came through, and there was a fair amount of conflict there. And that's one of the jobs of the Civil War veterans. They were put in charge of security in some cases, so they were put in on the line to say, hey, we need to be protected from Native American raids throughout this process, and some veterans were put in charge of that. So thank you for that question. And what's funny is that there was this massive economic opportunity for both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, and as they were building, they were congratulated by those in American society, thinking, okay, well, these are going to be the companies that are really going to are really putting it on the line to be able to build this railroad. And it didn't take long for those companies to really kind of turn national attention against them because of some unsavory economic opportunities that they tried to have. Both companies, as well as other railroad companies, began being accused of bribing government officials. They were driving up costs, particularly for farmers in the West. Those who were meant to prosper going out west. These farmers ended up having to not be able to afford sending their crops to markets to the west or to the east because of the prices that the railroad companies kind of skyrocketed up as those prices, as the price of moving those crops. So the crops that farmers were able to grow, and they were able to grow pretty significantly in these new territories, but they didn't have the places to take them. So all these crops end up spoiling, and it's another opportunity that farmers end up not having the ability to prosper through even though they had some opportunities, even though they had perceived opportunities, that because they had such fertile land in the West, they were able to grow well, but they didn't have the opportunity to actually make money off of it. price fixing by railroad companies was widespread, meaning that the company owners would get together and say, okay, we're going to set prices at this level to make sure that we all maximize our profits. So there was no, the idea of several companies of railroad for the railroad companies was that they would be in competition with each other. Instead of that, they all agreed to have higher than necessary prices. So they wouldn't compete with each other. They would just kind of set their own partnerships and be able to set their own priorities as a group and say, you know what, all of us can make money if we all set these prices. Which led to the Interstate Commerce Commission, which became our first sort of regulatory agency over private businesses. And its job was to watch for these types of abuses by the railroad companies. However, they had very little enforcement available. Congress, the presidency at the time, were still very well connected to the railroad companies. So they were not willing and able, the commission was not able to enforce most of the different rules that they tried to have as this new agency regulating the companies. Any questions as we move forward? So that was the sets of about the railroads, so the building of the railroads. No questions so far, so thank you. And now we'll move on to the new tycoons of the Gilded Age. And the first one was John D. Rockefeller, and he became sort of the paramount of the idea of either a robber baron, which is sort of a negative term, thinking about the fact that they are he and others were seen as taking advantage of their workers, that we'll talk about in a little while. Or was he a captain of industry? Did he create wealth for not only for himself but for others around the United States? So Rockefeller began in humble beginnings, growing up in Ohio. He does end up able to go to business school and becomes a produce salesman. And he ends up being able to get one of the ways that wealthier Americans were able to get out of going to war during the Civil War was pay for someone else to go in their stead. So if their draft number came up, in the case of Rockefeller, he basically paid the government to have someone else go for him. Someone who was willing to go, of course, but he was able to stay in Ohio and end up making a sizable fortune because of the lack of produce, the lack of he was able to have a much higher price for his produce than it was previously. So he was able to make a lot. His great wealth began with the sales of his produce stand, that he then moves to oil. He hears about oil being discovered in Pittsburgh. He decides to sell off his fortune or his companies that he's able to create during the Civil War, and he decides to focus in on the oil industry and sets up a new company called Standard Oil. And part of the way he's able to make money is as most companies, when they made oil, they made kerosene, which was the most popular part of oil. Once it's produced, it's used for the lighting for the early cars. Kerosene was the only thing that was really usefully made from oil. Well, Rockefeller decides, well, you know what? I bet I could use other parts of the oil that is wasted. I bet I could use it for other things. So he ends up using the paraffin that comes from oil in candles. He uses the petroleum jelly for medical supplies, and he's able to sell even more of the byproducts for new road materials as parts of America are rebuilt after the Civil War. So this is one of Rockefeller's big contributions to American society, that he's not just using the most beneficial parts of oil, but he is using everything. So he does not want to waste anything and basically lose money. He's now making more money than anyone else and able to produce more than anyone else. because of the other parts of oil that he that he is able to create. Now, naturally, a question just popped up. Don't other companies start doing that? Yes, but after Rockefeller. So Rockefeller already sort of corners the market on some of these other products. You know, the candles, the medical supplies, the raw materials. Roosevelt, because Rockefeller was the first to do it. He immediately kind of gets recognition for that, and because he gets recognition for that, he is able to immediately benefit from deals he then makes with railroads. So railroad companies see Rockefeller starting to sell not only the oil, but is able to sell all the other products from the oil. And him producing them means that they have to be shipped somewhere. And so all of the different railroad companies coming out of Ohio immediately go to Rockefeller and say, hey, why don't you use my company to ship off your goods? Another company, hey Rockefeller, why don't you use my company? So Rockefeller decides that he wants to make a deal. You know, he sees this as an opportunity to make more money and save more money for his company. So he immediately decides to look at those companies and say, hey, what are you going to give me? I want a lower price for my oil to be shipped from your railroad stations or for your railroad companies. Rockefeller is then able to use those new profits, lower his prices, and immediately cause his competition to fail. So the age-old question, how do you get other people to buy your products is by having it cheaper, having a quality product cheap. And that's what Rockefeller was able to do with his Standard Oil Company. He was able to reduce the price based on his deals with the railroad companies. And as I mentioned on a couple of slides ago, this was a big deal because railroad companies were able to kind of essentially make their own choices, make their own decisions on how much they were going to charge people for going on their railroads. So Rockefeller is immediately able to prosper himself by doing this. And as his competition fails, Rockefeller starts buying up those other oil companies and essentially create his Standard Oil Trust, or a monopoly on the oil companies across the United States, which leads to less competition. And Rockefeller, after having lower prices that cause his competition fails, as he buys up that competition, he's then able to raise the prices back up because now he doesn't have his competition anymore, which leads to the sort of the balancing act of the Rockefeller legacy, that he was the first American billionaire, but he also had unfair labor practices. Part of the things that he quote unquote saved on was employment, and on his that he did not pay particularly good wages to his workers, even though the company was doing very, very well. And even when eventually his trust was broken up back in the early 1900s, even though his trust is broken up, even though he's told you cannot own this company anymore, when he sells that trust, when he sells off his monopoly, and we start seeing the oil companies that we know today, he ends up making millions because he is able to sell. He's basically, he doesn't just kind of he doesn't just break up his company. He sells parts of his company, so he's able to make even more money, able to retire, and then sort of again the unbalancing of his legacy. He begins donating millions upon millions of dollars for the rest of his life to different foundations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, that helps many Americans over the years. And Rockefeller actually once said that the idea of providing better wages was not necessarily the most helpful to his workers, but having a legacy of foundations, his foundation work, his donations, was a much more beneficial way of helping other Americans. Which leads us to our next question. What was a way that Standard Oil was able to have more profits? Did he discard everything but the kerosene for lamps? Did he buy out his competitors? Or did he keep raising wages for his employees? Give you guys a minute or so. Answers came very quick. Thank you all. It was buying out the competitors, creating his Standard Oil monopoly. So thank you. Thank you for the good questions or being able to post. The next tycoon is Andrew Carnegie. He makes his money based on the need for steel, that he's able to very much prosper on what was perceived as a need for steel for new railroads, for new cars, for new naval ships for the U.S., for new skyscrapers that are building in cities across the country. So Carnegie, much like Rockefeller, has very humble beginnings, moving from Scotland to Allegheny, Pennsylvania. First begins as a works in a cotton mill, as a laborer, and then a bookkeeper, because the higher ups in the company, see him as a very smart individual, so they do kind of help him along in his business work. He then moves to the railroad business and becomes a personal secretary of the superintendent of the Pittsburgh Railroad, and gains a mentor in Thomas Scott, who also works not only for the railroad, but then goes to work for the the U.S. Department of War, which becomes the Department of Defense years later. But Scott brings Carnegie along, and Carnegie becomes the superintendent of the military railways. So think about all the Union supplies during the Civil War. Carnegie is able to manage their movements. And as the Civil War ends, Carnegie sees that there is new wealth that is possible in the steel industry. That particularly the Bessemer process, which is able to produce steel at a much faster and cheaper rate than previously. Carnegie sees this as his major point of being able to increase his wealth. And he builds his wealth on something called vertical integration. So we think back to Rockefeller. He mastered what's called horizontal integration, meaning that he had his own oil company, but then he bought many other oil companies. He was able to eliminate competition to then make his money. Carnegie does vertical integration, that he first is successful in his steel company, in making steel and selling it, but then he sees the opportunity to not necessarily buy more or buy more steel companies, but he wants to buy the production, which are the iron ore mines, and then he buys the companies that actually use steel, so mainly the rails companies. So he's able to make more money based on reducing costs of both production of steel, both using the iron ores and his own company, but then also the use of the goods on the railways. He's able to then make more money that way. Carnegie also benefited from the productive workforce, that he wanted to make sure his workers were feeling invested, and also promote the talent within his company as he went along and made many millions when he was actually able to sell his steel company and the rest of his integration for $500 million, which he then, much like Rockefeller, used in philanthropy with promotion of the arts, like the Carnegie Hall, education, like Carnegie Mellon University, as well as libraries, which are named after him across the country. And that leads us to our next poll question. What was the difference between vertical and horizontal integration? Is there no difference? Is horizontal? I'm sorry, I'll let you guys read. Many of you are already answering, so I'll give you guys a minute. All right, thank you so much. So nice job. So yes, it is that horizontal is buying the same industries, while vertical is buying companies that that lead to each other. So thinking again with Carnegie, that he is not only buying, he has his own steel company, but also the iron ore companies as well as the rail companies. Very nice job. The third tycoon that we'll talk about is J.P. Morgan, and he's very different from Carnegie and Rockefeller. First, in that he was a child of privilege, so he did not come up from humble beginnings like Rockefeller and Carnegie. He was a son of already a very successful banker, and he was able to once pay for his own Civil War representative when he was called up. And J.P. Morgan also, as part of his service for the Civil War, actually sold Union guns, which ended up being defective during several battles. But J.P. Morgan himself was never found guilty of anything wrong with the production of his guns. But J.P. Morgan decides to move into banking as sort of America's banker. That during the Panic of 1873, he is able to take the negatives that happened throughout the American economy, but end up buying his own, making his millions by stocks, by investments. And he's particularly able to buy up railroads, as well as he was actually the one who bought out Carnegie for his steel company in the early 1900s. And the other sort of big difference for J.P. Morgan from the other tycoons was that his legacy was investments. He was not a builder. He did not build companies like Carnegie and Rockefeller, but he invested. So he wanted to not only he wanted to own the steel company. He didn't want to build it. He wanted to help inventors like Thomas Edison to build up their electrical companies, not necessarily make it himself. So he was, he sort of took the American idea of building their own companies and sort of put it on his head and saying, you know what, we can make money on investments. If you invest wisely, that's how you can make money in our U.S. economy. The next idea we'll talk about is the new ideas of wealth. So people like Morgan, Carnegie, Rockefeller, they are certainly some of the most successful members of the Guild era, and there are many, many more Americans who are not successful. So what does it mean to be wealthy in America? Is it about hard work? Is it about inheritance? Is it about education or skill or intelligence? Or is it simply luck? And as you can probably imagine, those who were more successful certainly had their opinions and certainly had a better opportunity to be able to talk about their opinions rather than those who were not as successful. So one of the opinions that came around was the idea of social Darwinism. Now, Charles Darwin had set up his or had written his book on evolution several years before the idea of social Darwinism had come about. And the idea social Darwinism, they took the biological idea of better traits would be successful and would eventually rise to the top of evolution, while the unsuccessful traits would either die out or would become subservient to the successful ones. Social Darwinism kind of took that same idea in the societal idea, that those who had successful traits, those who perhaps were smarter, those who had a better work ethic, those who were had higher abilities, those people would be successful because their traits were going to be successful. Those who didn't were going to be the ones who are going to be poor, who are going to be not would not have success in the United States or in a capitalist society. Many people, even wealthy Americans, including Carnegie and Rockefeller, who are already opposed to Darwin thinking because of their religious beliefs, did not like this idea, did not believe in the idea of social Darwinism, that they were somehow, that it was that the rich basically had the opportunity to look down on the poor and look down on and not even want to help the poor because, well, it was just biology, it was just their traits. Carnegie instead wrote his own book and wrote his own philosophy called The Gospel of Wealth, that yes, successful people were successful for reasons. Yes, there are certain characteristics, but with those characteristics, they then have the responsibility to be charitable. So thinking about the Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations that they created, that was the idea of the gospel of wealth. That by being successful is wonderful and is nice, but it's certainly something that can be celebrated, but should also be should also give the opportunities for others. Be able to give money to philanthropy, for foundations, for charity. That was the importance of wealth in the United States. And then there was Horatio Algiers, who wrote pamphlets called The American Dream, and they were primarily written not for the wealthy, not even for the middle class or the working class, but more for the new immigrant populations. That Algiers' American Dreams were booklets that he essentially wrote about the characteristics of success in America. And it wasn't necessarily the success that Carnegie had or Rockefeller had, but just general accomplishment. Someone who was going to benefit society, who was going to work hard. He sort of created this idea that we now know as the American dream, that if you work hard, if you play by the rules, you will be successful. This was where that idea came from, that Algiers told this to immigrants. He showed them these articles. They read them. They believed in them, and that's how so many immigrants decided to stay in the United States and even come to the United States, was this idea of the American dream that Algiers wrote about, that success came from these attempts, that being good, being smart, being hard worker, those were the ways to be successful in the United States. So our final section now is on the politics of the Gilded Age. Now it's sort of, I don't know if I want to call it funny, but we sort of think about this era more for the economics, more for the Rockefellers and for the Carnegies, but not really for presidents. This is really a forgettable presidency era of the United States, and that's sort of strange to think about, because in most of our lifetimes, the presidency has been just that important, or was becoming more and more important in our lives. But during the Gilded Age, we really see the reduction of the presidency, and it starts with Andrew Johnson, who becomes president after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and Johnson really becomes irrelevant by his own making. That Johnson is because he rejects so much of what the Republican majority in the Congress wanted, so much of what the country wanted in terms of both not only Reconstruction but American society in general. Johnson was kind of sidelined for most of his presidency, and was even attempted to be impeached. So the Congress had tried to the Republicans were tired of Johnson. They did not want him in office anymore. So they even set up a kind of essentially a trap for him, that they passed a law that said he could not fire a cabinet official without congressional approval. And because Johnson's cabinet was filled with radical Republicans like the Congress and were appointees of Lincoln, so they weren't necessarily loyal to Johnson, Johnson essentially took the bait, and he has fired one of his cabinet officials, and Congress tried impeaching him, but they were unsuccessful by one vote in the U.S. Senate. They were not quite able to remove Johnson from office. But again, he sort of becomes irrelevant in American politics after during his 4 years or 5 years in office. 4 years in office, I should say. His successor is Ulysses S. Grant, the famous and popular Civil War general for the Union. And though Grant is able to do a lot in terms of the Reconstruction era and work with the Republican Congress, his time in office is really marred by corruption. That because he was never a politician, because he never held political office before, he sort of leaned on his advisors, his political advisors, and many of them were corrupt. That he had cabinet officials who took bribes regularly, and a particular scandal called the Credit Mobilier was set up to essentially, again, kind of line the pockets of Grant officials. Grant was never, was never lost popularity because of these troubles. He was always he was seen as the famous Civil War general, so everyone still loved him. So he is really the only two-term president in this era. Johnson never actually wins a campaign for president. Grant is able to be elected for 2 terms. His successor is Rutherford B. Hayes, which he basically has a downfall from the start, because in the presidential election of 1876, he actually loses the he actually has fewer electoral votes than his Democrat opponent, but because there was a deal made in Congress that allowed Hayes to become president, but then Democrats were able to kind of get their win by having all federal troops leave the South, for essentially ending Reconstruction. And so that became sort of a crooked deal that allowed Hayes to become president, thus never really having any chance of success during his administration. Next up was James Garfield, who came into office really on corruption already, because in his previous governorships, he was a big believer in what was called patronage, meaning that those who helped someone get elected would then be up for political positions. And one of those people, the people who thought they were supposed to get a job from Garfield, he didn't. And that is why he ends up assassinating Garfield within months of him becoming president. Garfield's successor, Chester Arthur, is actually is an actual presidential has presidential integrity. That he actually sees the assassination of Garfield and wakes up and says, you know what? Patronage is a bad idea. We need to have civil servants who actually belong in the job. So we should have reforms to be able to make sure that people who get jobs in government are qualified. Well, this was certainly a good idea, but he was basically rewarded for his integrity by not winning renomination. So the Republicans end up rejecting him as president, as a presidential nominee in 1884, for Arthur Arthur was not able to run for president because the Republican Party rejected him for his ideas. In general, this was a kind of a time of congressional supremacy that basically the presidents kind of stayed in the background, and Congress was able to basically pass whatever they wanted. Most of this was in Republican control, so they were able to pass a law, and then the Republican president, though corrupt as they were, would end up signing those bills. And unfortunately, we do see at both the local and state levels basically the same thing, that business owners and the wealthy basically are buying off congressional members of Congress, members of the state legislature, governors, and we see very little done in terms of corruption, in terms of regulating industries, until after this Gilded Age really comes to an end with the beginning of the Progressive Era. That again kind of begins at the city level when people become a little bit more fed up with the corruption at the city level, and it kind of builds up to the federal level with the election, or with the becoming a president when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. And that comes to the end of my presentation. I will stay online for a couple more minutes. I will end the recording, but I appreciate you all your attention, your questions. Please feel free to type in any other questions you have. But thank you again, and have a good day.